If you would turn in your Bibles to the 21st chapter of the book of Acts, we're going to lay a little bit of a historical foundation for our main emphasis, of course, in our devotional reading a few minutes ago, and this will serve as a background with the realization that so many times we fail to realize that these historical events that we can read about and can ponder simply illustrate the fact that while we may be 2,000 years removed from the events, the principles remain the same. We're still dealing with the same type of difficulties. There are people in particular places that we must deal with on a regular basis, and there's a way to do that that's in accordance with God's will, and that's the reason why we have examples like this. We know, of course, in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4, that primarily Paul has reference to the Old Testament when he says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope." But in a very general way as well, these historical events of the New Testament, while there are not specific applications to us, we take those principles and apply them to our life and realize that just as surely as it was the case then, that they were not promised tomorrow, that they were blessed with opportunity even as we are today, along with opportunity comes tremendous responsibility. And when we fail in our responsibility, when we face opportunity, then we are in a miserable and a pathetic situation. And sadly, people don't give the time of day to thinking like that, but that is entirely accurate. And we must do that, even as we've assembled together today. It's not just something that applies on a Sunday morning when we happen to be assembled inside a building and worshiping God, but it applies tomorrow on the job or wherever you was at on yesterday as well. We have this solemn obligation that God has blessed us with the ability to know the right thing to do, but not be satisfied just to know it, but to go ahead and do it. And it is only then that we will be blessed in our efforts to not only know, but also to do. Well, keep in mind that we have Paul ends up being imprisoned in our particular devotional reading a few minutes ago, but it goes all the way back to the 21st chapter of the book of Acts. Paul, of course, has made his way, as he's been trying for quite some time. You remember that he was trying to get back to Jerusalem in order to have a greater opportunity to influence his Jewish brethren in the flesh to accept the gospel that he at one time was thought a rival religion to Judaism, and he was doing his very best to stamp it out. And remember in Acts chapter 20 how that he had even called for the Ephesian elders to meet him on the island of Miletus so he would not be slowed down with the opportunity to get back to Jerusalem. Well, he makes it back to Jerusalem for sure, but when he gets back there, he runs into, of course, opposition. There are Jews that do not much like it that he has, in fact, turned his back on the religion of his forefathers, which was, in fact, a precursor for what he's experiencing in Christianity anyhow. And so they cause trouble, and it's necessary for the Roman authorities to intervene, or else he's going to be pulled into pieces. And it's sort of almost comical as to how that he is led by an escape from this mob who is out to do him physical harm. They want to, in fact, shut his mouth permanently. And so in chapter 22, Paul has the opportunity to speak. And of course, when Paul speaks, it ain't speaking, it's preaching. So as he begins to preach, he's preaching from a stairway, and that's exactly what the text tells us. And it says something about a castle there. And of course, if your concept of a castle is my concept of a castle, then we're talking about, the round table, and you got Sir Lancelot and all that. But that's not the idea here. The castle is, in fact, the soldiers' barracks, and it's multiple stories. And so here he is, and he's preaching to this group of people that just a few minutes earlier were trying to kill him, and now they're being made to listen to his sermon. And that's thanks to the Roman authorities. The Roman government has been beneficial in saving the life of Paul so that Paul can explain himself as to why he's doing what he's doing. And then, of course, chapter 23 begins, remember, in verse number 1, where Paul makes the amazing statement that he has never done anything that was contrary to his conscience. Wow. I have lived in all good conscience before God to this day. Can you say that? I can't say that. Paul said that. Now, obviously, when you think back to what Paul's conscience was allowing him to do previously, then just because you can do what you do with a clear conscience doesn't mean that's what you ought to be doing. Because his conscience was not bothering him when he was observing as he held the coats of those young men that stoned Stephen to death. His conscience didn't bother him at all. As we talked about in Bible class just a few minutes ago, Paul really did think that he was doing the right thing when he was contributing to the death of Christians. So his conscience wasn't bothering him, but he was wrong. He was mistaken. He later says, as he writes to a young preacher by the name of Timothy, he did it ignorantly and in unbelief. Sincerely, but ignorant all at the same time. Now, sadly, we live in a world in which those two concepts don't find themselves hitched together very much, do they? If somebody's ignorant or not sincere, but yet that's exactly what Paul was. He was ignorant of the truth. Should he have been able to have spotted the Messiah when the Messiah came? Well, sure he should have been. But he wasn't the only one that didn't, was he? Thankfully, he learned better. And he's brought before the council, as we read here in chapter 23, and there is that notion of there being such a thing as a resurrection from the dead that makes its way to the discussion. Well, Paul uses the opportunity that you've got a divided assembly here, and that part of the group that is assembled do not believe in any such thing as a resurrection from the dead. And so, ends up, they fight among themselves. Those who are opposed to Paul end up getting into it with each other over this resurrection from the dead business. And all of a sudden, in the midst of all this, a plot is discovered that there's some guys that have made a vow and they're not going to eat until they kill Paul. And thankfully, once again, he is saved by the Roman authorities. Specifically, the leader of that group that saves him is a man by the name of Claudius Lysias, and he ends up sending Paul to Caesarea from Jerusalem. Now, the reason being is that the Roman authorities think that under their control, this prisoner, who is in fact a Roman citizen, if he stays in Jerusalem, he's going to be end up dead, and that's not going to sit well that a Roman citizen is killed on our charge, and so they send him to Caesarea. And then in chapter 4, or chapter 24, notice the first verse beginning. And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders. That's not elders of the Lord's church, men that meet the qualifications of 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. No. These are the elders of the people. These are the rulers of the Jewish order of things. But not just them, they have a certain orator. And there's significance to that term that Dr. Luke uses here in referring to him as an orator. The Greek word, you can see it there, it's a word from which we get our English word rhetoric. Here is the nice way to refer to him here is an advocate. This is a professional talker, is what he is. He's real good at talking. He talks and talks and talks. He's good at it. He's been hired to talk. The only problem with that is he ain't got a clue about what he's talking about. And that's found out pretty quick. Not only is he hired to be a talker, but here's what he's doing in his talk that he's been hired to do. He is informing the governor against good old Apostle Paul. Now, the words that are used there to describe what this guy's doing, this orator's doing, can literally be taken to mean that he is talking down on Paul. Now, that sounds sort of rough, you know. I mean, it doesn't read too smoothly, and we wouldn't express ourselves like that. But that's what he's doing. He's saying bad things about the person that he's been hired to talk about. And he's good at it. As a matter of fact, he's probably got a series of events that he's going to be responsible for doing his orations about for the rest of the calendar year. He's so good at what he's doing. Well, what does it say for a person like that who can be hired to say just about anything if the money's right? Tell you what it does say. It says there'll always be somebody that'll hire you to do that. Sometimes a congregation will hire you and claim that you're a gospel preacher. Don't make it so. Here is a professional speaker who is accusing, talking down on poor old Apostle Paul. Pick it up in verse 2. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, that's Paul saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. What do you call that? You call that buttering up the man in charge. I don't know how we ever got to this point without your wonderful leadership, sir. You're the most greatest president we've ever had. If we'd had more people like you in a position, then we wouldn't be in the heap of trouble that we're presently in. That's what he's saying. Now, why would he say that? Because he's a professional talker. That's what he is. And so he's buttering up because he's fixing to lambast falsely the Apostle Paul. We accepted always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Notwithstanding, that I be not further tedious unto thee. In other words, all that preliminary stuff was just talking to butter you up. Now I'm going to get to the business. I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. Now compare that, what Tertullus says there at the beginning, as he addresses Felix, to what Paul says here in verse 10 later on. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. And notice he didn't try to one-up the professional speaker. He didn't butter him up even more than he'd already been buttered, you know. It's sort of like introductions, you know. I cannot remember exactly who it was that made this observation a few years ago. They said that introductions are sort of like French perfume. A little bit's all right, but if you get very much, it just stinks. And that's the way introductions are. And that's what we have happening here at the hands of this professional talker as he's accusing the Apostle Paul. And here's the specific charges that he has been paid to make against Paul. He says, this man here, that you can see standing right over here, this man has been exciting the Jews to sedition, which is just a fancy way of he's a division causer. He was born to be a division causer. Everywhere he's went, he's been a division causer, and that's what he's about to do to the Jews. And you know good and well, if you're in a position as you are, as the leader, and you got somebody in your midst that's causing division, it's not going to sit well with you. They didn't say all that, but obviously that's implied in it. He says this fellow here is a ringleader of a sect that's called the Nazarenes. And even I, if I was sitting in the audience, I'd say, what's he talking about? And then he says, and this fellow here is guilty of all things of profaning the temple. We saw him with a Gentile. And we know that he took that Gentile into the temple. Whoa. Pretty serious charges. How does Paul respond? Paul says, and I think this is interesting when he begins to defend himself, he says, listen, I've not been here long enough to cause any division among the Jews. I ain't been here but 12 days. If you're going to cause great upheaval among a nation of people, then you need more than just a little small amount of time. I can't do it. And he wasn't arguing with anybody. He was accused of arguing and causing trouble. He wasn't arguing with anybody. And all he really had to say is this right here. This professional talker that has been hired by the religious leaders of the Jews has no proof whatsoever of those things he accused me of. No proof. Isn't it amazing that way back in the first century, you didn't even have to have proof either. You just say what you want to say. Somebody will cover for you. So, especially if they're paying you and you're in charge. Paul says there is absolutely no proof of these charges. And then notice in verse 14, he agrees, but their conclusion about what they've accused him is faulty because he's the one, not them, that actually believes in the Mosaic Law and actually believes in the prophets. He believes that when Moses said, as Peter has already said back in Acts chapter 3, that Moses spoke all these events and spoke concerning a prophet that will be raised up like unto me, and him you shall hearken in all things, or you'll be cut off from among the people. Who's the one that really believes what Moses wrote? Who is it that really believes the Old Testament prophets? Is it these Jews that are trying to stop a gospel preacher from preaching and converting Jewish brethren? And it's not Paul. In this situation, Paul is the only one that does believe the law and the prophets. Certainly not them. And he cannot be successfully proven to be disrespectful. The very reason why he's come back to Jerusalem is because he's got money to help those people who are in need of daily necessities because of a famine. Well, that should settle it right there. Let this man go. I mean, he ain't done nothing. But that's certainly not the way it went, is it? It's not the way it is. We would take up reading, and this is simply reading again what was read in our devotional reading a few minutes ago, but let's read it again quickly. And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way. What way is that? Christianity. He knows. And he should know. If he's going to be in a position of being a leader of these people, then he needs to know something about what has happened previously and the results that have led to the situation that he's an eyewitness to right here. And he said, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded the centurion to keep Paul, and they let him have liberty, that is freedom, that nobody should forbid him to see his acquaintances, and they could come in and talk to him. And then after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled. And he answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. Now let's look real quickly at the audience, the sermon, and the results of this little brief situation that we have recorded for us. First, notice the man, Felix. Vincent Word Studies lets us in on some historical information that I think is beneficial here. Let's simply read it. Tacitus, who was a Roman soldier and also a Roman historian, did his historical work from AD 50 to AD 120 in that time frame. Tacitus says of him that he, and this is Felix, he exercised the authority of a king with the spirit of a slave. Now that might cause you to ponder, what in the world is he trying to say? You know. But right on the surface, it doesn't sound like a compliment, does it? It sure doesn't. And here's what he means by that. By reason of the powerful influence at his command, he supposed that he might perpetuate with impunity every kind of villainy. In other words, if he's in charge, and he is, no holds barred in what he'll do. There is no standard of morality in the Roman upper echelons. We can do what we want to do because we can do what we want to do. We can cover for ourselves just fine. Notice it also in Vincent Word Studies tells us that he had persuaded his wife Drusilla to leave her husband and marry him. And then he had also employed murderers to kill the high priest by the name of Jonathan, and might well tremble at the preaching of the judgment to come. He identifies the fact that since this man had been so cutthroat, then when he actually hears the truth preached by a faithful gospel preacher, no wonder he's shaking. Now there is a man, Vincent, who is simply chronicling for us what transpired there and giving his insight, which seems to me to be right on, in assessing just exactly why he's feeling like he's feeling. But he's not the only one. His wife Drusilla is here. And here's what the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says about Drusilla. Paul's being left in bonds on the retirement of Felix, that's when his room is emptied, that's the idea, was due to the desire of Felix to please Drusilla. In other words, instead of just giving the Jews what they wanted. It was to give his wife what she wanted. Who is this woman? I had preached a sermon one time on the Herods, and we talked about this woman at that time. She was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great, who murdered all the babies in Bethlehem trying to get rid of Jesus. That means then that she was the great niece of Herod Antipas, who is the Herod that beheaded John the Immerser. It also means that she was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who, when she was about 6 years old, is the Herod that murdered James with a sword in Acts chapter 12. And was going to kill Peter too. And remember, Peter escaped with an angel letting him out of jail at night. Thinking about her history, this woman, when she was 16 years old, was seduced away from her husband by Felix. 16 years old. And she is said, no pictures I don't think are available, but she is said to be a physically beautiful woman. So here she is. She's married to the governor. She is possesses great physical beauty. She's well connected to the Herods, who've been powerful people in this part of the world for many, many years. So she's got all these things going for her, but notice what isn't going for her. What about her spiritual beauty? Has she got any of that? You know? Now she has the opportunity, right along with her husband, to hear the gospel preached, but there's no indication whatsoever that it has any bearing on her at all. And interesting little side information, they had a son together that ended up dying in the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 70 because he lived in Pompeii. Now if you had the opportunity, say you did have the opportunity, to preach to powerful people in a position like this that Paul had, what would that sermon entail? You know, what would be involved in that sermon? I think that's something that not just preachers should consider, but I think we all should consider. How many opportunities do we have to say what needs to be said? And of course, from Good News Today and being ready to give an answer, if we do have the opportunity to say something, do we know the right thing to say? These are things that I think matter a whole lot more than whether our tie matches our suit or not. Matters a whole lot more than whether we're going to buy a new vehicle or not. These are matters that are eternal in their consequences. The responsibility of a Christian is great. And specifically here, the responsibility of a gospel preacher like the Apostle Paul is great. He's got to preach nothing other than the truth. Of course, it's Paul in Galatians chapter 1, as he has to deal with Judaizing teachers, no doubt some of his own Jewish brethren, who are influencing Gentiles, that they cannot be satisfied to simply obey the gospel. They got to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses to a certain extent in order to be saved, which is false, which Paul says is another gospel. And he says, but though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we've preached unto you, let him be accursed. As I said before, so say I now again, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than that which ye have received, let him be accursed. Paul knew that the power of God unto salvation is the gospel. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. And Paul knew this. I mean, here he is. He's a prisoner. He knows that he may not ever get to preach again. I know I've said this before. If I knew somehow, some way, you know, that I only had one more sermon to preach, what would that sermon be? And then I think about the last sermon that Jesus preached when he knew it was his last sermon. Read Matthew chapter 24 and 25 sometime. Jesus looked upon that material as being so significant that it being his last sermon, he would preach on that. Would our material fit into the same category as the category of the material that Jesus chose in Matthew 24 and 25? In verse 6 of 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul says, for I am now ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but to all them that love his appearing. You see, Paul knew by the time this second epistle of Timothy was penned, it's getting towards the end. But he could confidently say that if he never preached again, when he did preach, he preached the whole counsel of God. And thus he was pure from the blood of all men, not just those Ephesian elders that he mentions in Acts chapter 20. Hey, think about this from another standpoint. How many more sermons do you think you're going to get to hear? You don't know. This could very well be the last sermon I preach and the last sermon you hear, for all we know. Go to now, ye that say tomorrow will go into a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. For whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It's a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanisheth away. Paul in this sermon did not deal with marginal or unimportant matters, did he? He didn't try to tone it down so as to not adversely affect those who were going to be hearing what he said. He was not in the ear-tickling business. He didn't talk in vague generalities where people say, you know, I couldn't ever figure out where he's talking about me or talking about somebody else. He didn't do it. He didn't leave it up to the audience to make the connection. He made it for them. He didn't talk to them about how they could be happy if they made more money or how they might improve their physical appearance. Now, what does that matter? Doesn't matter at all. And obviously, he did not engage in flattery. Even though he's standing before people who have been flattered over and over and over again by those who stood before them. What was his sermon? He reasoned. He actually appealed to their minds. If somebody claims to be preaching the gospel and they're not appealing to your mind to get you to think, then you're not hearing the gospel preached. That's a fact. If somebody is not appealing to your minds to get you to feel a certain way because you're walking contrary to the message that's preached, then the gospel is not being preached. Here it means to think different things with oneself, to ponder. To ponder. And there's three main points, and those, he's following the general rule. 3 points of conclusion, and the sermon is theirs. He preaches concerning righteousness. Old English way to righteousness is right wiseness. It could very well be called and translated as justice. Is justice a topic that is deserving of our attention at all times? Sure. Have I not said that I am firmly convinced from my examination of the Scripture that the Lord does not like it when a referee is crooked? Because He's a just God. If He's calling strikes one way for one team and another way for the other team, then that person is living contrary to God's will. Because God is a just God. And thus what Paul is preaching is justice, the righteousness of God. He's also preaching temperance or self-control. If there's anybody that need to hear about temperance and self-control, then it's old Felix here. He took away a man's 16-year-old wife. He's living like a heathen. He's expanded the borders of his infamy. He needs to hear about self-control. You notice Paul is not preaching about consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. That's not what he's doing. And then he nails it home by preaching on the judgment to come. What was the effect? Well, evidently Drusilla didn't pay a bit of attention to what was said. Is it possible that Drusilla possessed one of those seared consciences? What is a seared conscience? We find the biblical basis for that concept in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, when Paul recognizes that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons. And then verse 42, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared as with a hot iron. Now that big old phrase there, seared with a hot iron, that's one Greek word. Here it is. And there it is, anglicized. Do you see the word cauterize in that word? It's there. It's the idea of branding something. It's the idea in a medical sense to cauterize something. Have you ever seen anybody on one of those good old westerns, you know, that gets shot with an arrow, you know, and they pull that arrow out and then they stick a piece of metal in the fire and they stick the thing on there, you know? Tough. But they're making that skin to where it'll heal, the blood will quit running, and you have a hard time operating on that part of your body ever again because it's been made impossible to deal with as normal skin is. That's the idea of a seared conscience. Is it possible that Drusilla, she's inherited these false ideas relative to right and proper, and now she has a seared conscience? We don't know. And what about Felix, though? He is frightened. Frightened. The exact same word that's translated frightened here is used in Luke chapter 24, verse 5, when the ladies come to the tomb and their angels are there instead of the Lord. They're frightened too. They're frightened too. Felix is so frightened that he's shaking. Not only is he shaking, sadly, he's procrastinating too. Now, is there any doubt whatsoever that this man knows at the preaching of the Apostle Paul that there's some changes he needs to make in his life? He knows that. And I dare say if Drusilla's paying much attention, while she's maybe not making an application to herself, then she knows this guy she's married to has some changes he needs to make in his life. And the demonstration of that is the fear and the trembling that he is experiencing. But does he do anything about it? No. He says, go thy way for this time. And then, of course, verse 26 tells us he hoped that maybe he could make a little money off of Paul if he put off till tomorrow doing what he rightfully knew he needed to do today. Isn't that sad? The conclusion, of course, which is the basis for invitation songs and even lessons like this, is that as far as the record goes, Felix never did come up on a convenient season. He just never did get around to doing what he needed to do. He just didn't do it. And the word there translated is to changing of an unfavorable time for a favorable one. And here are some of the ways it's translated in other scriptures. Do you realize that what we see demonstrated here in many respects is the devil's very best sermon? It goes like this. As far as I'm concerned, there is no God. As far as I'm concerned, presently anyhow, there is no Jesus. There's no heaven. There's no hell. And anyhow, there's no hurry if there happens to be any of those. How many people have passed into eternity unprepared because they bought into the devil's very best sermon? Hopefully nobody in this audience would fit into that category, but the possibility exists that it may be the case. That there are those here today who never have obeyed the gospel. It may be that you've been waiting on a convenient season when time was a little bit better for you. When you got all your ducks in the row in this one area so that now you can give your attention to these matters that you know that are essential to the salvation of your soul. Why not do something about it today? Do today what you know to do. Obey the simple gospel plan. Hearing, believing. Repent of your sins. Confess the name of Christ so that you then might be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of your sins with the assurance that the Lord will add you to His church. And then after doing so, just stay faithful and heaven will be your eternal home. If you're subject to heaven's invitation in any way, let us know how we can help you while together we stand and while we sing.
Have you been to Jesus?